Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Secret Origins of Mint Condition. I am your host, James, and I guess this is a Star Wars edition of the podcast where we're picking up where we left off on our May the 4th episode. We were talking about the Jedi Order, and we said we would reconvene about our thoughts once the Acolyte had come out. So that has happened. We're finally getting to it. I know it's come out probably by the time this gets released. It's been at least a month before since it's been out, and hopefully everyone's seen it who's listening to this episode, because we will be doing spoilers. So if you have not seen the Acolyte and you want to watch it, don't listen to this episode until you've seen it. But of course, continuing to join me from our May the 4th episode is John.
Hey, everyone.
And Josh.
For light and life.
Let's just dive into it. So we kind of, I think when we wrapped up our May the 4th episode, we realized that the Jedi were not always the people we thought they were or were portrayed to be, at least in that original trilogy. It seems like since the original trilogy, putting in thoughts that the Jedi are not the people they seem to be has been a theme in the prequels, and then obviously a theme in the sequels. But I feel like the Acolyte definitely showed that there's a different side to the Jedi. So let's just start with there. John, overall thoughts of the series, and maybe like our coming from our previous discussion about them.
Yeah. So this series is to me it's a bit of a swing and a miss. A good effort, but didn't quite didn't quite come together on a few different levels. But it had all the pieces. I felt like it could have, if it leaned a little more into the Knights of the Old Republic way of storytelling and sort of transporting Star Wars further enough back, but making it coherent without being too tied to what's coming next, I think it would have felt a little bit better. And it was just all over the place. The characters were all over the place. It didn't really know what it was. In other words, I felt almost like the writers were jumping from episode to episode, like, oh wait, that's what we did in the previous episode. We got to sort of make that work. And that's always the danger also of doing flashbacks within a very limited miniseries. But stylistically good. I thought that the acting overall was pretty good with some, again, it was a lot of hit and miss. So I think it was a valiant attempt. But right with what you're saying, I can't wait to discuss what it did. It did take the risk delving into the nature of the Jedi. And that I think was its most successful component, even if that may also be its most controversial component, was that it was showing, yeah, it's not nearly as simple as we thought. And I don't know how Star Wars fans in general are going to react to that, or how they did react to that, especially with the news today that the series is not coming back. I wonder how many people are going to blame that on the way the Jedi were portrayed in this. But yeah, I mean, it needed something a little more.
Yeah, I feel like it was maybe an episode too long, or 2 episodes too long. I think it could have been 6. It didn't necessarily need to be 8 as a series. And I felt like they were trying to do a lot. And again, just you coming, the cancellation of the show it just came out as we started this episode, audience. And I feel like pop culture these days is so banking on people being reactive to it and enjoying it that they leave threads hanging, and they sometimes don't get sequels. Like I was having this conversation with Jack recently. Not that this is a good example, but I finally watched after how many 10 years or 8 years, Terminator Genesis, which was trying to reboot the franchise. They were like planning on a trilogy. They didn't get past the first movie, and they left huge plot, like the sort of boldness or arrogance or the betting that you think you're going to get to continue your story past one season or one movie these days. I think is a lot to ask, considering like where things have been. But that's a whole other topic. I don't want to get down that road. But yeah, they went a lot of places, and now who knows when these threads will be picked up. But Josh, what are your thoughts about the series and what we've been talking about?
Well, just really quick to respond to what you just said, I think this season was a pretty self-contained story. The only thing that was sort of left hanging, or, I mean, really sort of a setup for future seasons, was the master-apprentice relationship between May and the stranger, the Manny Jacinto character, which I think does represent a new status quo. So they went through this whole story where those two characters, well, specifically the May character, did go on a journey she started in one place and she ended up somewhere completely different. That was sort of the setup for a new phase. So I was pretty satisfied with this season as like a unit of story. One other thing I was really intrigued by, I think it had the largest screen time to impact ratio for me, was the sort of political intrigue between the Jedi and the Senate. I think there were two scenes with that Senator Ryan Court character, the second of which where he really verbalized the flaws of the Jedi Order and how they operate as an institution. He really gave voice to the flaws that people like us describe about the Jedi. And I thought that that dynamic between, you know, the institutional political power of representatives in the Senate and this sort of hermetically sealed dogmatic religious order, I thought was really, really fascinating when they depicted that tension in those two scenes. So I'm sad that we probably won't be getting any more of that, because I thought that they were certainly setting that up as a side plot, or maybe potentially later on a main plot of the show. Going back overall, I really enjoyed this a lot. It wasn't my favorite of the series, because Andor is my favorite of the series, which isn't, you know, really a fair comparison, because I think that Andor is some of the best TV just in general of like the last decade or so. So it's not a super fair comparison, but you know, I've never really been all that interested in the Jedi, especially since they were depicted in the prequels as sort of these, you know, rigid, dogmatic, monotone bureaucrats on Xanax. But that said, like, I was intrigued getting to see them before the Phantom Menace, and we could see some of those cracks forming. And the show was really saying, you know, the Jedi have positioned themselves in this situation where, because of their hegemonic power in the galaxy, they see themselves as the galaxy's police, to the point where they even are trying to control these other societies or cultures of force users that have naturally arisen outside of their influence. And I thought that playing out those flaws, in particular in the person of Jedi Master Saul, and what he's responsible for, and what that whole group of Jedi is responsible for on Brendok, you know, making literal the like subtext of the prequels, where in the prequels you never felt like the movies were saying the Jedi have problems. It felt like those movies were saying the Jedi are good. They were just blinded by this more powerful, malevolent force that they failed to see in time. Whereas this show was saying, no, these are flaws baked into the Jedi Order for generations and generations. And I thought that was really compelling and really interesting. And for my money, the best place you could go with the depiction of the Jedi that we got in the prequels. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. I was really looking forward to watching the new episode every week. And like John said, they took some big swings. I think they made contact more often than they missed, for my money. It didn't feel like reheated leftovers. They had me from the first scene with Jedi Master Trinity. You know, and that fight scene, that sort of combat that we haven't seen from the Jedi in a Star Wars movie, I was like, oh, okay, they're doing something new and interesting here. And that sustained me through the first two episodes, which was a lot of table setting for what was to come later. And I wish we were going to get more. I'm a little pissed off that we're not going to get more.
Yeah.
Seemingly.
I mean, I'm just going to say, despite my few critiques so far, I like this show too. Of the Star Wars shows that we've gotten on Disney Plus, I would probably put it in terms of like just individual seasons, because that's how I kind of look at these shows, not just as the show, but individual seasons. It's probably my top 5 of seasons of some of the Star Wars stuff we've gotten overall. I really enjoyed it. It gave. I thought it did a good job, even though it's only 100 years before the Phantom Menace. It did a good job of finally giving us something not directly connected to Skywalkers and our usual Rebel troop and usual Empire troop. I mean, all of this stuff, you can obviously see the threads of how it reaches back to our main characters and our mainstay, but it wasn't like directly in your face, and you got new people. So I was for it. It's just, you know, I agree. I think, Josh, I agree with both what both of you were saying. It took some big swings. I think it connected more times than it didn't. Sometimes when it didn't, it was kind of hard to keep focus or to pick up the thread. But I guess let's just dive in. You know, this is not a play-by-play on kind of how we review shows when we do it on this podcast. is just kind of giving our impressions and stuff. So let's go back to like diving into some of the Jedi stuff we've already touched upon. I mean, it's clear like one of the flaws built in to the Jedi system is, is demonstrated by Indara and was it Venestra, that cover-ups is not something new for the Jedi. They're willing to turn a blind eye to save face of how the Jedi Order is viewed internally and externally, which I don't think we got cover-ups in the movies we've seen so far. So that's like sort of new. Am I correct in terms of like? I mean, there's deception and maybe sleight of hand, but this was like outright covering up misdeeds.
It definitely felt like it was taking it to a different level. Um, the prequels showed the calcification and the blindness of the Jedi to the threats, which was mixed in with their arrogance. Um, but there wasn't a sense in the prequel movies that the Jedi were, morally questionable in any way. You got the sense that they might just be out of touch, for lack of a better term. This showed something deeper, which I felt was always the bigger question hanging over the Jedi, which is okay. Well, the story of Anakin is and Anakin's fall, is initially sort of seen as something relatively isolated, but it's pretty clear even in the movies that the way it happened, the way that we've just when we discussed it in that previous episode, the lack of compassion the Jedi showed to their own in the case of Anakin, that there was in fact a moral failing if it wasn't what we think of as classic morality of good versus evil, that lack of compassion, that lack of expansiveness and understanding that not every situation can be easily understood by some clear cut rules, especially in a giant universe with all kinds of different factors. And this show went into that. The Force doesn't just manifest through Jedi. The Force doesn't choose Jedi. The Jedi are create themselves, and then are created and supported by the Republic to control the Force and to control how, what we call, not humans, but how sentient organic life manages the Force, and they have monopoly on it. They have a government sanctioned monopoly on it, which is something that again only is touched on, but is very real on the prequels. Like you don't actually get that sense in episodes 4 through 6. That sort of could have easily been, well, the Jedi are Force practitioners, and then you have Dark Jedi as well. The prequels gave us the concept that they have this monopoly, and that was a big question in the show. Is like, well, we know sort of instinctually that monopolies tend to lead to abuses of power, both in a market but also in governments. Josh, you used the word hegemony. That's exactly what the Jedi have, and now they encounter a group that is hinted at to be related to different Force users that we've encountered. I don't know if people think they really were they good or bad or questionable, but they were themselves. They were living, and they clearly had been under some sort of threat and had some sort of difficulty. And the Jedi didn't really seem to care about any of that. This was about coming in and being, okay, we have to take over here. We have to make sure that all the Force users are under our jurisdiction. That arrogance and that lack of understanding that they don't know everything, that they aren't the masters of the Force in every manifestation it has, shows where the Jedi start cracking. And just like episode 8, it pisses the fans off because the Jedi are supposed to be this perfect embodiment of the light. And this is good. This is actually good that it's showing that, yeah, this is the problem with thinking that one group is always right, always good, and always flawless, and then giving us a very human manifestation of that, of where the faults come in. I thought actually the most surprising scene to me was how Master Soul slays Osha's mother. And it was completely reactive, but it was reactive arrogance. It was, we are going to do what we're going to do here. We're going to threaten them, and not knowing what her mother was doing. It could have been a threat, could have not been a threat, but we didn't know exactly what she was doing with her powers at that point. Pull out the lightsaber and kills her, and then covers it up because, yes, there's a big secret about how the two children were created. Is it something wrong or right? Big question marks, everything else. But that was a huge, thing. And you can't tell me that over the thousands of years of the old Republic Jedi have never made questionable decisions. You know, that would be the thing. I think that where the show got a little bit weak was that it didn't have faith in itself to explore that question and the morality, and or because it's not tied to the Jedi, can really live in the gray. It can really explore the different facets of, like, I mean, even in that show, the sense of, like, yeah, there are people following the Empire who are not evil people. What do you do with that? Because they're just trying to survive. They're just trying to live their lives. And that question got explored in a way that didn't in any way justify the Empire or justify the people who served the Empire. But it gave you this big question and the exploration of it and the complexity, and you came away with a sense of, like, that was really fascinating. That really gave me deep characters that I want to know more about, that I want to see, even if I can't agree with what they do. This show didn't have faith in itself to quite do that, because you're under the rules of the Jedi. In the end, the Jedi are all supposed to be good, and the Dark Jedi are bad. And that's sort of my last point, is that the great villain, the masked secret master that you don't get their identity until the end. And I didn't see that one coming. I should have. I look back, I'm like, okay, this is pretty obvious who it was. But what was up towards the end? And that, what was the episode? Teach/corrupt. You're getting the sense of the dark side. Yeah, there's anger, but it's about, hey, wait a second. The Jedi are denying a whole facet of existence to you. And we're not just all about being awful and evil and controlling and hateful. And that was something that I didn't expect, was exploring the dark side as a valid way of living with the Force. That's the sense I got from it, was, wow, like that's something I wanted to see more of.
That actually reminds me of that Onion headline, "Worst person you know," actually makes a really good point. What I mean by that, the reason why it strikes a chord is because the Jedi are flawed. They aren't this unalloyed force for good because of some of their rigid rules and beliefs. And that lends credence to the rest of the argument. What undercuts his argument is that he just slaughtered a bunch of innocent people in a really cruel way. So the seduction gets at some truths, but you can't ignore what he actually is and what he does. One thing, though, that you did touch on in terms of the fan reaction to the depiction of the Jedi, I really struggle to understand the problems some people had with the depiction of the Jedi in the show or breaking canon. Like, I didn't think that it did or said anything that contradicted anything we already knew. I didn't think it depicted anything even particularly controversial, surprising, but nothing that was sacrilegious or nonsensical or flied in the face of anything we already knew. The only thing I can think of, well, there are two things. A lot of people just had it out for this show because of the diverse casting and the fact that the writer showrunner was a queer woman, so they just had it out for the show from the beginning. And the other thing is kind of a Venn diagram with a lot of these same people, but I think that a lot of Star Wars fans have this simplistic view and this literal reading of things that are depicted in the movies. Like, it makes total sense to me that the legend of the Jedi, the way they are presented in the original trilogy, is sort of this romanticized notion of the ideal of what the Jedi were at their height and at their greatest. But you were saying, John, 1,000 generations of an institution with thousands or millions of followers, when you look at it closely, is going to have some problematic shit in there. And I don't understand why it's such an affront to certain people whenever the Jedi are depicted as anything other than pure paragons of virtue. I don't understand it. Because also there's no story there.
No, there isn't, but it's the connection there is that you're going back to the Star Wars of being a kid.
Right.
And it's so simple back then. Watching the same movie as a child and watching as an adult is a very different experience, and I think a lot of people want to go back to that simplicity and the TV show where it's the good versus evil. When we do reviews here of shows like Transformers and GI Joe, they're literally constructed to be simple good versus evil stories, but that's why they don't hold up past age 12, you know, because that's not what any story really unfolds. Even, in any form of literature or medium, you're not going to find that simplistic except in a few children's stories. So when you want that, and then you want to put it into an actually fully fleshed out universe, you're going to run into problems. And I think that's where the fans are. And something else you said about like the way the fans reacted to a diverse casting, a queer showrunner. We're in a weird time that feels so different than just 10 years ago, where this fan backlash, I don't know whether it is because there's so much onlineness to everything, uh, but there's just this like need to be validated only in the way that you want to be validated. And I say that sort of, I mean, I think we all experience that to some degree. But when I see the fans, they're like, okay, we want the magic of our youth transported into a modern movie. Not really possible to do. There's a great meme going around about that. Like, why did you love it when you were a kid? Why can't you love it the same way now? Because your mind's different, your life experience is different. But also that how things have become put into this idea of in groups and out groups is something that I just don't remember being quite as potent as we were trying to move in the 90s towards diversity. And we weren't there. But as these baby steps are being taken, it was sort of a fait accompli. Oh, we're going to move towards diversity. And occasionally somebody would say that. But when somebody said recently about a Marvel cast and said, "Oh well, Kang was the first Black Marvel, villain, and you had, the Black Panther as a." I was like, "Well, what about Blade in the '90s?" Because Black Panther was finally giving a big movie, but and there was a lot of importance to that. But it sort of we forget the weird progress of the '90s, which was this sort of like middling, stumbling, and I don't know why people weren't so hostile back in the day and what created it today. And that takes away from shows like this because just by virtue of having a queer showrunner, people will say, I'm not going to watch that. It's going to be woke. It's going to be this. It's going to be that. And we weren't saying that about 20 years ago. But at that point, diverse voices were also not being heard. Again, it was baby steps. Occasionally, you would have a queer character, and it was usually just tragic. Occasionally, you would have a Black character, and it was like, okay, you have one or two, but it felt like it was acceptable to continue moving in a direction. Now it's just by virtue of having any character or any showrunner who isn't straight, white, and male is seen as like an affront to that population. And that's what I don't understand. Because it's like, hey, you're still getting 80% of the directors, 80% of the casting. What is it you're missing here? Is it that you literally want an all-white cast? And weirdly enough, Star Wars touches on that very topic in its original movies. The Empire is all white and male. The rebels are
And
diverse.
human.
And yeah, exactly human. It was only a fictionalized novel after the fact that brings in Thrawn. That was not canon in the movies, and was only later canonized. Canonized. That's a funny use of that word. But that was intentional on Lucas's part. The Empire is xenophobic, racist, and sexist, all in one. Even if it wasn't doing so with blatant terminology, it was doing so in its very existence. It was meant to be that. And I don't understand how these fans don't see it that way. Like, yeah, the Empire, the bad guy, is manifesting all those things, and the rebels are the diverse group of ragtag people who have to figure out a way to survive and then overthrow the Empire.
Oh, but
Yeah.
that's also why, just as a very slight aside, why when in the sequels they had, slightly more diverse casting of the First Order, I actually thought as a result of Hollywood's progress in terms of diversified casting, actually diluted the depiction of the Empire in the original trilogy
Mm.
in like a controversial way that like you can't fault them for wanting to employ actors of various backgrounds, but I think when you show fascists who are women and people of color, it diminishes the impact of how they were depicted in the original trilogy. I understand the quandary. Like I wouldn't say no, you should not employ women and people of color.
And isn't it interesting how that became a double-edged sword? Because if you're going to represent this fascist empire, and I'm comfortable using that word because that's literally
Yeah.
what the empire was supposed to be.
Hmm.
even if they don't use that term in the movies proper, um, is that if you do represent it as it was represented in those original movies, are you going to then further anger people who say, "Well, why are you making them all white?" You're sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't in the modern media environment. Um, and so that
Right.
goes
So
for the villains, and it goes for your heroes, because then when you cast Rey, everybody freaks out. How can you have a woman Jedi? And this is, and I have Osha, and who I thought the performances in this, especially between the sisters and pulling those scenes off, and the casting of the kids, I thought was remarkably good. That itself becomes a controversial point instead of being a more interesting, diverse way of showing that the Jedi exist across all spectrums. And again, the villain here, the villain was not a white male. The villain was Manny Dinsita, who's amazing. Who I will admit, I am a big fan of The Good Place.
Oh, you had a hard time with that too? How you
So,
had a
so
hard
initially, I kept expecting him to break the fourth wall and like laugh or say something or do it, because that character was so good in The Good Place. Like, Jason was just brilliant because somebody who could act that dumb while simultaneously being sort of profound, and it's at the
He
same
touches
time.
upon it in this show first before he reveals who he is, with
Yeah,
that
yeah,
the
and I
being
thought that was great.
the
We get
bumbling
that, and
assistant.
it's sort of like bringing it whole circle. So that's why I felt like, oh, they're bringing some good place into this, which is why I think in the end I had a very different impression of a villain than it just being another evil, scary Sith who's just pure anger, malice, and everything else. He's the bad guy, as you pointed out. He slaughters innocents. But the complex question is, he doesn't seem just awful and repulsive. I mean, physically attractive. He nailed that. So that makes people uncomfortable, I think, sometimes. It's like, how come the bad guy isn't this manifestation of what we think of as evil and ugly and bad? The Emperor is all, destroyed by the Force lightning. Vader's is all mechanical horror Frankenstein. The Stranger is really hot. I mean, and they deliberately film it in that way. He's sexualized at different points in coming out of the water and everything else, and that's sort of like, oh, what do you do with that? So again, that's where the show took some big swings, and the disconnects were more, I think, in how it was put together rather than the attempt at actually doing it. And maybe that's just the fact that they're like, okay, we got to fill 8 episodes, we got to do this, we got to do this. I feel like a lot of shows like this suffer under the fact that they either have to expand out to fill episodes or compress too much into too few episodes. I feel like if the writers were given and the showrunners were given a little more say in the beginning, like, how many episodes do you need to tell a good story? And they say 7. Okay, we'll do 7 episodes. 3. Okay, we'll do 3 episodes. Give the writers and the showrunners a little more freedom over that, or negotiate it to say, do you have another story to tell? Do we want to split this more episodically, and tell some different things? And maybe that's where the show was trying to stretch it out with doing the flashbacks into the childhood, which again, the big miss was it wasn't believable. The fire wasn't believable. We all knew there had to be a bigger thing about it, but it was revealed in such a way that was anticlimactic and still didn't fit. It's like, wait, it was just a fire that everybody died in the fire? And they're pretty powerful force users, but everybody died in the fire. And then even the answer to that question was, oh, okay, well, the Jedi are still sort of responsible, but wait, this still doesn't make sense. It didn't quite work. It's like they're reaching for that story component and not getting there because, I don't know, it's something was missing there. But I think that's also the difficulty of dealing with a new interpretation, a new representation of the Force. I mean, again, do you think they are the Sisters of Dathomir specifically, or another offshoot
I think
similar?
they're like a branch. I was taking it
yeah.
as a branch of the Sisters of Dathomir, or maybe Sisters of Dathomir who
Yeah,
left Dathomir for whatever reason.
there was no evil vibe from them. I loved the internal conflict of how to raise children, their relationships, and it was such a non-issue same-sex relationship. It felt so just like, yeah, they're both the mothers. It didn't even click to me that that would have been something controversial or different for Star Wars until I started reading about it. I don't know, maybe that's just where my head is at, until I started seeing people react to it. I was just like, oh, well, how else would it be? This is like a sisterhood, and they have something else going on. Like, this is really cool. Um,
John, I was just to your point, like we were talking about. I think a lot of like, unfortunately, in our day and age, like outrage gets attention, and
yeah,
and I tend to believe that like the loudest voices get the most attention. I feel like there's more people who are less bothered by what's going on in some of these shows than is actually portrayed. Like, I mean, if you go to YouTube, I mean, YouTube is like one of those things, like any social media thing, like kind of draws you to whatever people are attracted to. And like, I pass by all that stuff. So when I see like my YouTube thing of videos, it's like I usually rely on Screen Crush and New Rock Stars, people who are like us, enjoy it, pick on it, but still love it. And so there's not this like, I don't see all the outrage. I mean, and if I see it, I skip over because I
yeah.
don't really take that as like true like do I have nitpicks? We all have nitpicks about this show, but am I still happy I saw it and I exist? Yeah. I mean, I also come from a place mentally like I think about like when we were in the store like 20 years ago and a show like this came out, would we be so happy? We would be so happy to see 8 episodes of a Star Wars television
Yeah,
show
yeah.
on what Channel 11 or Fox or whatever network they decide to put it on. I would be like, we wouldn't be talking about it in probably some of the same like way we're talking about this show just because of what we've been through.
You're so right. We get lucky with these shows, and sometimes don't realize that we live in this sort of like era of plenty. I've been listening to the autobiography of Patrick Stewart and hearing how close the Next Generation was to getting canceled, and that was what we were. Those are the shows we were discussing in the store back in the day. We were lucky to get what we got on Channel 11 and 9 and 5 and everything else. Like it was crazy, and now we do sort of have this like embarrassment of riches, if you will. And I'm okay with Disney pulling back to 2 shows a year.
Yeah, I agree with you.
That's understandable. I think they focus on quality rather than necessarily appeasing those audiences, because I think Andor being a great example, and others, is that when you actually are a little more focused on good storytelling, and you're not worried about the outrage machine, even the most objectable content to certain populations that just want to be angry about things, they come around and watch the show. That's one thing I've noticed about ratings of shows like this. If it's high quality and good, we do that when we review Doctor Who, like the good episodes, the good seasons, they get the audience. Even if you get a million people posting, this is it, this is the last straw, I'm never watching Doctor Who, I'm never watching Star Wars again. I see that every time. I say, well, obviously that can't be true. But if you focus on the good storytelling, you focus on giving the creative teams behind this, some really good support. Do that for 2 shows, and you will have popular shows, and you'll be able to push the envelope too on all these questions that people want to be outraged out. You know, and this, I'm not out. There's nothing to be outraged with this show except that it could have come
Nothing.
together a little bit better.
No.
There's really nothing bad. I thought some of the casting was actually really inspiring. And I don't know if you all noticed, I picked up on this. I was like, that young Jedi looks really familiar. Who is that? Who is it? And I'm sitting there, and I happen to look up at my bookshelf, and then I realized that was King Tommen from Game of Thrones. That was the poor tragic king, and I was like, that's the look. That's that same look. Poor guy always ends up in characters that end up.
With that character, if we kind of look, I mean, not to like placing blame on the whatever happened is hard to place, but it's really his fault. He kind of like he wanted to be out of there, and he went back, and that's. I mean,
Yeah.
not saying Soul is not responsible for his own actions of what like instigated after they returned, but it was interesting to see. Like we talk about Anakin being whiny. No, Torben is
Yeah.
sort of a whiny, complaining Jedi who doesn't like. He is not the Anakin
Yeah.
Skywalker.
Well,
He also looked a lot like Anakin Skywalker.
he
Yeah.
did.
This is intentional.
Uh, do you know what you just made me think of? And this might be slightly controversial to say, but when we were covering Andor on Trash Compactor, some of the guests made the observation that their depiction of encounters with police was very familiar to certain communities who are often policed, in a certain way, for lack of a better term. Like, especially at the end of Andor, where the authorities at every opportunity chose the thing that would escalate the situation rather than de-escalate the situation. And in a certain way, it's because like that's how they're trained, that's their job. So when they get involved in a situation, quite often it actually makes it worse and ends in tragedy for the community who's on the receiving end of their interaction or their authority. And I got that same vibe from the Jedi, the way that they dealt with the witches. None of them had any ill intent. None of them was like a bad guy per se. But because of the nature of their interaction, the nature of the power dynamics, it ended in tragedy, completely wiping out the entire community because of misunderstandings and, well intentioned but fatal tragic mistakes, which really resonated given the Jedi's position as sort of the unofficial police of the galaxy. Like they showed up and they, well meaning, not trying to start a fight, but they said, like, hey guys, it's our way or the highway. And
Yeah.
the community, by nature of existing and having a different way of doing things and wanting to be left alone, that was not an option. So when there was an engagement of any kind, when those are the terms, you will not be left alone and you have to acquiesce to our rules and our control. There was no other way that situation would end except in tragedy.
Yeah. Well, I would, that's sort of this goes back to like the interesting point where why we started this whole conversation with the May the 4th episode. It's like I could see the situation going differently if Obi-Wan Kenobi was there. That would not like he would
Older
have
Obi-Wan, yeah.
yeah, older, even like in the Clone Wars TV show, like he would battle and obviously was a general, but he did work hard to like I guess it goes back on the person who's the Jedi. Maybe I don't know, but like like if Obi Wan's training was like if you encounter other Force users who are not Jedi, you don't have to. I don't know if Obi Wan would have handled this situation the same way, and he would also probably I think have better managed the Jedi under his control. I'm just more saying like reflecting on it, like that was definitely a bad situation. They escalated. They say it's our way or the highway. Soul, I think I'm like I think even at that moment he had sort of an agenda with the kids and his perception of what was happening to them, that they were under threat, and we don't even know what the ceremony would have really involved with the children. So Soul is making his own
Yeah.
judgments and stuff like that. But not that we haven't talked about especially Obi-Wan and his own flaws and stuff, but I don't think it would have escalated like that if he was the master in charge of that group.
And you got to ask, what about Yoda with that little cameo of the top of his head at the very end? You get like, what was Yoda thinking back then? Because we got the sense, and again, in official Star Wars prequel movies, that Yoda was, even at that point, not making the best decisions when it came to Anakin. Which I think that to me should have been the more controversial than anything that's been done since. Was like if you want to rail against your childhood perfection of the Jedi being taken away, it was Yoda in episodes 1 through 3. Um, where do they stand? Weirdly enough, this gives the Jedi credence to the idea of controlling and limiting your emotions, because Soul was very much giving into his emotions, even in that first encounter, not just afterwards. And it was that feeling of like, I have to protect and save this person without acknowledging or exploring the larger context of what's going like. Oh yes, there's a versions in the Force here. They maybe were created, two from one. What the hell is that all about? Is that right? Is it wrong? All these things that need to be explored, but took an absolute approach, but also was like, it was so emotional. It was so like impulsive. I have to do this. I have to do this right now, and I don't care what the consequences are. That was actually very not Jedi. So in that sense, you could actually argue that it was deviating from many of the Jedi's precepts that got them into this in the first place. But then every other Jedi seems to do so in their own way. They're all diverging from this idea of self control in their own way, and every character explores it in their own way. Maybe that might have been actually the brilliance that could have been what made these episodes work a little bit better, and even a longer season, was exploring each, as opposed to just watching each Jedi get have attempt to take them out, or it could have been, well, let's explore why each one of them has gone down their own path. I love seeing a Wookiee Jedi. That was brilliant. um, in isolation, one locked in meditation. Um, the other Master Soul just sort of still out of it. Like explore why they each were dealing with this in their own ways, but they all knew it was wrong. They all knew something went dramatically wrong, and the Jedi Institution was not there for them. What does that mean? What is that lack? Lack of support for them and lack of understanding and then secrecy and then more secrecy. So they keep secret what they were doing the whole time, and then their masters have to then cover up the whole thing and then keep all that from the Senate in the end. And secrets upon secrets, this lack of support. There's a bigger story there that I felt if they used that as the through line for the show, really would have been a good connective tissue. That secrets upon secrets don't work, and that's why the Jedi are failing.
I think they would have gotten to it through the relationship between the Jedi and the Senate. I think that would have revealed some of those problems in a way that was more sort of front and center. It is interesting. A part of the fundamental problem of the Jedi becoming so institutionalized and so part of the fabric of civil society of the republic is that the function of an institution is to protect itself, to perpetuate itself. So they don't have a choice. I mean, obviously they do have a choice, but the needs of the institution demand that they cover this up, because to fail to cover it up would give ammunition to the Senate and their perceived enemies like Senator Ryancourt to hobble them, and that's just not an option. Um, Again, I think there was a lot of really interesting stuff that this show brought to the fore, and I really thought that its contributions were really worthy of further exploration. And again, I'm bummed that this is seemingly the end of the show, because I think it got way more right than it got wrong. And this show had me wanting to stay up until midnight or whenever it was to watch the new episode as soon as possible, because I was, flaws and all, like I was that engaged, which for my money is the most that you can ask for. Is like, I just want to see the next episode. I've been thinking about it all week and I want to see what's going to happen next. And this show, for me, mostly delivered the goods, which is more than I can say for the Star Wars shows that have been on offer in the last couple of years. And frankly, most shows in general. So, yeah, I really liked it. And I'm bummed that it's not going to get another bite at the apple.
Do you think they would have been able to really explore in a second season May being trained in the dark side and what that was going to be like? I have a bigger question as to whether it was the writers or the executives that really maybe didn't know how to do that, or if that was itself on brand for Star Wars. It's one thing to go off Jedi and Andor, but a story that might largely focus on uh, the training and going down the dark side. That's a really tough one. We still are viewing from the outside what happened to Anakin. We weren't seeing the everyday because those are movies. The second season for this would be more the everyday of, like, instead of watching Yoda train Luke, it would be watching, the stranger training May, and that would be a really fascinating story. But I would almost be scared to tell that story if I didn't really have a grasp of it. And that's where I felt the season was a little bit weak, is that they didn't have faith in their own story. And then my last comment as we get close to wrapping up was that the direction was the weakest part of this show for me. Maybe that's what took me out of it a lot. Scene cuts, especially the combat scenes on the jungle planet, made no sense to me. It was like, we're gonna do this part of the fight, then jump to the next part, and that wasn't just the fight scenes. There were a lot of the emotional beats where it would just be cuts between all the different things going on in ways that I'm not a director. I'm not even really a writer, but it didn't feel right. It didn't feel like it worked because it took me out of it. Maybe that was why I enjoy discussing the show so much, but the actual watching of it left me feeling like I needed it to come together a little bit better. Um, and going back to having listened to that autobiography about Next Generation, my God, that's how every show used to be. It needed one or two seasons to get its legs beneath it. So all of our critiques here are actually of a show that probably has this enormous potential, this enormous capability. And that first season is, okay, we got that done. We managed to get through it. Now we're beginning to figure out who we are, who the characters are.
Now we know how to do this show.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 So the idea of not giving a show 4 seasons is sort of short-circuiting that entire process of all these grand shows from the past that we referred to. Well, they were given an opportunity to really mess up for a season before becoming what they ultimately were. And that's something that we don't get anymore. These Netflix cancels 1 or 2 seasons. You're done. You're done. You're done. And Disney is now being equally ruthless because the demands of the streaming era are forcing them to consolidate so quickly. I'm hoping that that expands back out at some point. But that would be my greatest critique of a show like this, is that I enjoyed it. When I swing and a miss, I say, but they took the swing, and you got to give shows more time. I would be so back for a second season because I think that they would really be able to figure out who they are now, as showrunners, as the actors, and everything else, and we'd be in for quite a treat. So, Disney, when you're listening, give give shows a chance while simultaneously being rigorous in your demands of them.
Yeah, I agree. And I know we're about to wrap up in a moment, but I will just say, like, aside from like if they would lean into seeing a Sith apprentice trained, I think it would have been a very deep character context and maybe hard to watch. Is Yoda is about to be told that we made this huge cover up. Like the last scene is her going to Yoda, which on the council, not on the council, I don't know how long he was been on the council, but he's about to be told, like, we did this whole thing. What do we do, Master? And I have no idea what
Yeah.
the Yoda we know would do with that, except that we know he's on the council and what happens in the Clone Wars. So I thought that would have been a fascinating thing of like
Oh yeah.
exploring that character's morality and all that stuff in terms of this grander plot that has happened that he has no knowledge of, that we know of.
And what if that Sith story was a story of redemption for one or both of those characters?
Oh yeah,
What if this isn't the origin of Darth Plagueis? What if this is another Sith and it shows us a totally different trajectory of how things can go? That they go down the dark side and maybe one or both of them together have to come back from it. That's a story I would love to see. And I think the audiences, if you do it well, if you give them enough time to really find what they're doing in a show, audiences would reward that, even if it doesn't follow into the traditional mythology. I think we would really find something interesting in that.
absolutely, absolutely.
So,
Well, listening audience, those are our thoughts right now about the Acolyte, and we probably could have more, but we probably will have more in future episodes. I mean, hopefully, we'll see some more from whatever Disney's planning to do with the Star Wars saga at this point. But obviously, if you have your thoughts about what we've said or thoughts about the Acolyte when we post this episode, we'd love to hear from you in the Facebook group. So please post them there. And then we are on Instagram as well at Secret Origins MC. But I'm very grateful to have back my two hosts slash guests to talk about this. So thank you, John.
glad to be here.
And thank you, Josh.
Hashtag renew the Acolyte.
Yes, yes. See you, Disney. If you're listening, please reconsider and maybe bring the show back for another season. We thank you all for listening, and we'll talk to you on the next episode.